Good morning. I just want to let people know that, see if you can hear me.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Just want to let you know that our YouTube is live. And I talked with IT both yesterday after the hearing and a few minutes ago. And basically, what they keep telling me is that the link works. And then it seems like the witnesses are telling me, no, the link doesn't work. So all I can report to you is that it's necessary to keep refreshing the browser when you YouTube. So that if you had the YouTube on before when the link was posted, not all browsers automatically refresh the link, and that because they were pulling it up from home, they were pulling it up from their phones. So I think next time I'm just going to directly link the witness that can't get it with IT.
I thought your answer was going to put the IT people under oath, but
No, but I am considering anybody who freezes up has to be in the building next time. Although from the article I read in the Post, the editorial this morning indicated that it is DC, that it has less people downtown right now. So I don't know if Santa Fe falls in that category too. Seems like whenever I'm trying to get out of the parking garage, there's a lot of people, especially standing right in front of the exit. But is anybody going to have anything procedural that we need to deal with before we go on the record this morning? Mr. Jernigan, can you update us? Is Mr. Gorman going to be available when we go?
Yes, ma'am. I was just speaking to him just a few moments ago. He should be ready. Can't tell if I can see him on my.
Oh, there he is. He is there, and it looks like for the people that just got admitted, just want to let you know we are live on YouTube at this point. And I was just asking if anybody had any procedural things that we needed to deal with, and also reporting that I talked with IT after the hearing yesterday and again this morning, and they have assured me that the link from the commission website is operable, was operable, and that the problem is a user error regarding refreshing the browser. And I was just kidding with the council, saying next time if it doesn't work, I'm just going to hook the people up with IT. The other thing I'm considering for repeated audio, video freezing problems, I may make a rule that those people have to be in the building. Okay, well, we're almost ready. Mr. Jernigan, I feel like you're trying to hypnotize me with those fan blades.
It's nothing that quite subtle for me, I'm afraid.
Ms. Hurst,
Mr. Marks?
that's how I know my internet's not frozen, as I can see the fan moving. Whenever.
You know, I always wanted to have time to study the concept of subliminal messaging, you know, that they say is like in written, it used to be in like written print or whatever, you know, so I'm just wondering. Okay, well, I got a call from my co-hearing examiner who was on the road and is headed in. So I'd like to wait just a couple of minutes for that. And good morning, Commissioner. We are live on YouTube and we're waiting for one more person before we begin.
Good morning.
Judge,
Mr. Lee,
I think the Dropbox you sent me was from the original hearing, and I need the current Dropbox.
all right, sir.
At least the first SBS exhibit is Mr. Luth.
All right, I thought I sent the one, but I will have that taken care of, Mr. Lee.
Thank you, Judge.
Madam Hearing Examiner,
Ms. Drake,
I just got an email from Mr. Gorman that he's in the waiting
yes,
room.
he is.
Okay, okay,
I see
great.
him. No,
Okay,
he's here.
thank you.
I see him. I was just gonna wait to admit him.
Sure.
Once we were live on the hearing.
Okay,
Well, we're live, but I mean, once we begin our hearing, let me just walk next door and I'll be right back.
okay.
Okay, we should be starting momentarily. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the bench request that I alluded to yesterday, and the commissioner's here to help me with that. Make sure that I get it figured out and, Ms. Hardy, Mr. Stewart, do we have Mr. Berger listening in on YouTube?
Jeffrey Stewart for SPS. I'm not entirely sure. Let me reach out to him and see.
Okay. That would be good. Okay, it looks like co-hearing examiner Allen is here, so we can go ahead and begin our hearing this morning. Good morning, welcome back. We are live on YouTube and we are beginning the second day of our hearing in case number 22-0015. This is in the matter of Southwestern Public Service Company's advice notice number 303. And we're coming back from our hearing yesterday. And this the first thing procedural wise is I would like to issue a bench request to SPS, similar to the examples that Mr. Berger provided in the attachments to his testimony, WLB Stip 3, and he began that on page 1. And we would like Mr. Berger to calculate how much the customer would pay and how how they would pay. In other words, in his examples, he has whether or not the payment would be in a backup service or a supplementary power or etc. And this particular customer uses 5,000 kW each hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and has installed a behind the meter 5,000 kW max capacity fixed tilt PV system. Commissioner, did I get that right?
That sounds great. If I could just maybe elaborate on, I think it's the very end of Mr. Berger's testimony, attachment WLB Stip 4. He's got a comparison of billings under LGST rate 34 and settlement tariff if solar generator does not operate. That's page 3 of 3. And what I'm interested in seeing is what if the solar generator does operate? And so, as hearing examiner Hurst mentioned, I think, we might assume, the same demand level of, 5,000 kilowatt demand in each hour of the day over a year is what I'm assuming was done here. And then if we had also a 5,000 kilowatt install capacity PV system, I think then we could see how much energy that system is generating and, what sort of payments would result to SPS.
Mr. Stewart, Ms. Hardy, any questions on that request?
No, I can confirm Mr. Berger is listening, and no questions at the moment. We'll see what we can do with that, and if there's any clarification, maybe we can bring it up later if we need anything.
Okay. And I'd like to have it by the end of the week, if not sooner.
Understood.
Okay. And the same with the other bench request.
Okay.
That was issued yesterday.
Yes, we are working on that one as well.
Very well. Thank you. All right. I believe then with the procedural matters out of the way that we can go ahead and continue with the presentation of our final witness. And I believe Mr. Jernigan, Ms. Drake, that you have a witness to present, correct?
Yes, ma'am. We would like to call Mr. Mike Gorman to the stand.
Very well. Mr. Gorman, please let me express my sympathies for the loss of your family member, and we appreciate your being available to us here today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Mr. Lee, would you please swear in Mr. Gorman?
Mr. Gorman, would you please raise your right hand?
Yes,
You solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the matter and upending should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
Thank you, sir.
Go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Gorman, could you please state your name and for the record?
My name is Michael Gorman, Gorman,
And by who are you employed and in what capacity?
employed by Brubaker and Associates as managing principal.
And you are here today. I'm sorry. Do you have a copy of what's been marked as LES FEA Stipulation Exhibit 1?
Yes,
And did you prepare or cause to prepare this testimony that's contained within?
I did. Yes,
And do you have any corrections to make to that?
I do not.
If I were to ask you the same questions that appear in your testimony, would your answers be the same?
They would.
And are your answers true and correct to the best of your knowledge?
Yes,
At this time, I'd like to move the admission of FEA or LES FEA Stipulation Exhibit 1.
Any objection to what has been identified as LES FEA Stipulation Exhibit 1, Mr. Gorman's direct testimony as affirmed by him here today? Hearing no objection, FEA LES or LES FEA Stipulation Exhibit 1 is admitted.
Thank you. And at this time, we'd like to make Mr. Gorman available for cross-examination.
Thank you very much. Commissioner, do you have questions for Mr. Gorman? You're
You're-
muted.
Just a few.
Go
Thank
ahead,
you
sir.
for being here, Mr. Gorman.
Morning.
Good morning. Is it your view that the proposed rate for the solar the solar standby rate would not result in subsidies from other large customers who are not on the standby rate?
It is, the solar standby rate was designed in such a way that if the solar facility did not produce energy, then the combination of standby capacity charges and standby energy charges, revenue collected by SPS would be equal to the demand charges that the customer would have paid under rate 34. So essentially, they would pay the same rate. If there's some behind the meter solar generation didn't operate, that they would have paid had they been on the rate 30 standard rate 34.
I see. That seems like an important case to consider. Did you also examine the case in which the solar plant was operating as expected?
We did. Yeah, that was part of the discussion on the appropriateness of the rate. In the event the solar facility works as expected, then the customer with behind the meter generation can avoid making the backup energy charge payments to the utility, which would reduce the amount of capacity contribution that customer would pay the utility, which should align with the utility's reduced cost of providing backup service to the customer with behind the meter solar generation.
And so did you perform those calculations, Mr. Gorman, to convince yourself that that was indeed the case, that I guess that the reduction in capacity payments was reasonable and was aligned with what SPS might have to expend for acquiring capacity?
The calculations were performed in the settlement negotiations. I think that New Mexico large customer group witness Higgins performed the calculations. I reviewed those, the company reviewed those. I believe other parties to the case also reviewed them. And they did demonstrate that the amount of credit to the customer with behind the meter generation should align with the reduction in the allocation of capacity cost across rate classes. With respect to forward-looking resource planning purposes, the impact of behind the meter generation working as expected will have the effect of reducing the company's net peak demand, which the utility must plan for in their resource planning purposes. To the extent behind the meter generation can impact customers' demands in such a way that SPS has to procure less production and transmission capacity to serve its net peak demand, then its cost will decline due to the existence of behind the meter generation. So that is the expectation as I see it for designing this rate, and it should align with a rate to customers that encourage them to maximize their load characteristics on the system through either demand side management or behind the meter generation investments, to modify their loads in such a way that SBS's system loads are as efficient as possible, that can reduce their cost of securing capacity resources to serve their demands. And in doing that, all customers on the system will benefit, and customers with behind the meter generation are able to make investments and or modifications of load characteristics to make their load characteristics as efficient as possible and reduce their cost of power as much as possible.
Were those calculations made a part of the record of this case?
Not the expectations of how they will impact resource planning going forward. I think the expectation there is once we have customers with behind the meter generation, and implementing this rate will encourage certain customers to go forward with that. Then there will be actual load characteristics or a history of operation of those behind the meter generations, which can confirm the impacts on system resource planning and SPS's cost of capacity resources.
Right. I suppose my point here is that we have seen in Mr. Berger's testimony 4 examples that apply to a dispatchable resource, and then this example of the case where you've got a solar distributed generator that doesn't work, and he's confirming that as you've said, the payments would be the same as under the LGST rate. However, we have not yet seen the case in which the solar DG is performing, and exactly how much in terms of a capacity credit or reduction in capacity payment we're looking at here.
Yeah, I believe his calculations demonstrate that based on what's known and measurable, within the cost of service the utility has right now, that implementing this rate will not result in a subsidy to customers with behind the meter solar generation from customers that do not have behind the meter solar generation. That is a way of confirming that this rate does not require customers without behind the meter generation to subsidize customers that do. So that the evolution of this rate then will be developed over time and will be based largely on actual load characteristics of customers after they do install behind the meter generation. So the ability to modify this rate going forward will truly reflect the SPS's cost of providing standby service to ensure that standby customers are priced based on their cost of service, and other customers are not providing subsidies to customers that take service under the standby service rate.
Okay, and Mr. Gorman, in the case that a large customer installs behind the meter PV as well as battery storage, which of these 2 cases would you see that as falling under?
With behind the meter solar generation with backup battery?
Well, yes, just to have, let's say 4-hour lithium-ion batteries for, however you might want to use those batteries for shifting your peak demand, or in whatever way you would choose to use them. My question is, would you consider that to fall under the solar option or the everything else option?
It would be under the solar option, but would enhance the probability that the solar generation will be available to offset the customer's contribution to the system peak demand. The net peak demand of the utility would be lower when you improve the likelihood that the behind the meter resource can take the customer's load off system during that coincident peak hour. So the way I would interpret it is it would be a solar option with an improved ability to use the behind the meter solar resource to reduce customers' demand during the period of system coincident peak.
Mr. Gorman, do you see much interest in option number 2, which would presumably be some dispatchable resource?
I do now simply because the options for different types of behind the meter generating resources is quite broad. Even from a renewable perspective, there can be behind the meter dispatchable resources. But dispatchable resource typically has pretty high probability of being operated during a period of system peak. So its capacity, its ability to take the customer's load off the system peak it has a higher probability under a thermal option. And that pricing structure for the option 2 or the thermal option reflects that greater probability of being able to use the behind the meter thermal resource to reduce demands during system peak compared to the solar option.
Do you know if there are any customers currently in the SPS New Mexico service area? Any large customers that have dispatchable generation?
I'm not aware of any, but it is my understanding that, with the movement to zero carbon or reduced carbon, that large industrial customers are looking at a significant different, any and all options are open at this time to both ensure that they can manage their cost of power, but also manage the power quality aspect of operating their systems. A lot of jurisdictions are moving to zero carbon, like New Mexico is, have a lot of uncertainty about whether or not non-dispatchable renewable resources will be as effective at managing power quality, voltage variations, and frequency controls. And the existence of behind the meter generation will help improve the power quality, or at least that offers the potential of improving power quality because it puts generation at the point of load.
Sure. And if I understood you correctly, you're talking about dispatchable renewable generation. What exactly would that be?
Well, one option, and I don't know if anybody's considering it, but one option could be a hydrogen fueled gas turbine. Is one thing that kind of comes to mind, but I'm not aware of any large industrial considering that option at this time. But it is possible that one could be considered with the standby service under option 2.
Sure. And the fact that it seems like you don't generally see behind the meter cogen or dispatchable resources at large customers. Do you think that's reflective of just the economics of it being cheaper to purchase power from the grid than to build your own, or would having a standby rate potentially help make the economics more attractive?
Well, the standby rate is necessary in order to typically to make behind the meter investment economics work. Because without it, then the customer would be looking at making investment in behind the meter generation and also paying the utility for full capacity obligations as if it did not have behind the meter generation. So the standby tariff is necessary in order to enhance the economics for behind the meter generation, to encourage customers that they find an economic resource to move forward with. But the changes in environmental laws, regulation, and certain corporate policies are changing the incentive that a lot of industry has for modifying their electrical demands and use of energy resources in a means that not only minimize the cost of power, but goals.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Gorman. I think that's all the questions that I have for now.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Gorman, I have a few questions for you. One of the big distinctions that seems to be or seems to have been made in this case is the distinction between solar and thermal. And I'm just wondering whether or not you talk about in your testimony on page 2, the question posed at lines 8 and 9, please provide a description of rate 85. You begin your answer at line 10 and you say that rate 85 will accommodate behind the meter customer generation for solar, renewable, and thermal generation resources. How do you define a thermal generation resource?
It is a resource that is dispatchable and operates on a fuel source. Natural gas, or there's a lot of movement towards hydrogen fueled generated resources. So those are kind of the most prevalent dispatchable generating resources that are being considered by many utilities today, in addition to additional nuclear generating resources.
So is it describing what one might think of as a conventional generation resource?
In terms of being dispatchable and controllable, I think that's a fair description. Yes.
But thermal doesn't necessarily mean that you're only limiting it to those who produce heat and electricity, are you?
No, it's not a combined heat and power. It could be strictly an electric power producing behind the meter resource. That's true.
And in your view, option 1 that's being offered in this case is not for all renewables, but just solar, correct?
That's my understanding. It was designed for a 2 megawatt or larger solar behind the meter resource.
And option 2 would be basically for any other type of behind the meter generation, renewable or thermal.
I think option 2 is designed for more of a dispatchable unit that has a high reliability to be available to bring the customer's load off during the coincident peak period and high energy demand periods. I don't think option 2 is really designed to reflect the renewable wind generation, for example. It's more of a dispatchable behind the meter resource.
Well, in response to some questions about whether or not this was a technology excluding proposed tariff, some of the witnesses yesterday were opining that they thought potentially that it might be used for certain renewable generation whose load profile was not like wind, but I guess was potentially more and not like solar, but was potentially something that could fit in, maybe like a biomass or a geothermal. Would you agree with that?
Either of those technologies, I think, probably would meet the reliability standard and the dispatchability standard. I think that might be an issue that the company would want to investigate with a customer, considering various technologies for behind the meter generation. But as I understand it, option 2 is designed for those facilities that have that can be controlled. The output of the facility can be controlled and there's a high probability that they can be used to offset the customer's contribution to the system peak demands.
So basically utilized in the same way that the option one is going to be used, correct?
Yeah, with the notable exception that there is more control of the behind the meter resource that allows the customer to use it to achieve certain objectives. In contrast, option one, where the solar unit is more of a variable resource where customer does not have control over when the sun is shining on the solar collector.
So knowing how much wind that SPS already has in its portfolio to use in its New Mexico jurisdiction, do you think it's realistic that some large customer might one day want to put up some wind turbines?
Say that the structure of option one would benefit more of a solar resource than a wind resource, just by the way the backup energy for on-peak, off-peak periods is designed. It would be more of an economic signal to customers to consider renewable resources that would operate during peak periods. So that would be more of a solar resource than it would for a wind resource.
So then am I understanding you that the thought is that a wind resource might not necessarily achieve the same goals for the self-generation customer that solar would?
Yes. Wind generation often can produce a lot of energy at night, which may not be helpful in reducing the customer's contribution to peak demands during the day. Where conversely, a solar unit would operate exclusively in the day and would not be operating at night. Exclusively
Well,
battery backup, of course.
then potentially, if it's not appropriate for a standby kind of tariff. Well, let me ask you that. Why do you believe that the solar option is appropriate for a standby tariff?
I believe it's appropriate because there's a lot of interest in behind the meter and demand side management initiatives by industrial customers, which can improve the load efficiency on the utility system, allow them to minimize the cost of providing service to all customers. So industrials and other big users are considering behind the meter resources is in line with other demand side management initiatives in order to improve the load demands that they place on the system. And a solar option at this time allows customers to reduce demands during peak periods, which allows them to reduce their contribution to the system peak and can also allow them to reduce their energy demands during peak periods.
And is that the base purpose for a standby tariff? Reduction of peak?
Those are the economics that would be considered by an industrial customer in deciding whether to invest in behind the meter generation. The standby tariff is a way for those customers that do invest in behind the meter resources to take backup service from the company in a manner that allows them to pay the company's cost of providing that backup service. So it's the on-peak, off-peak, and the economics which are driving the economic justification for behind-the-meter resource investments. And the standby tariff then is a way of ensuring that SPS is allowed to recover its full cost of providing backup service to those customers that invested behind the meter generation.
Do you think it might be appropriate in some other, more appropriate in some other kind of tariff?
No, I think this is the appropriate tariff. It is directly there as a means of ensuring SPS recovers its cost of service for backup, to provide backup service, and then allows customers to review the economics of making investments in behind the meter generation.
So then back to my wind question of it is somehow trying to utilize the benefits of wind generation. And in particular, behind the meter wind generation. If it's not appropriate for the standby tariff, is it appropriate for some other kind of tariff?
The economics of a wind generation would also require some sort of backup service from the utility. So to the extent customer was considering that type of investment option, then it likely would want some sort of backup service option from the utility. But to the extent the wind was producing more in the off-peak than in the on-peak, then the reductions to contribution to coincident demands may not be as great with the wind resource. So the need for a standby backup tariff that reduces demand charges would not be as much of the economic equation for a wind resource as it would for a solar resource. Most of the savings for wind might be more of a reduction in energy cost as opposed to non-energy cost.
Is that why that there's not a wind option in this proposed tariff?
I don't know if a wind option really got a lot of consideration because of the economics for behind the meter solar renewable generation was a primary focus. There was a lot of complexity working out a standby rate that accomplished the objective of ensuring that SPS fully recovered its cost of providing standby service for that type of behind the meter resource. And also a standby tariff that provided SPS an ability to recover its cost of providing standby service for a behind the meter thermal resource. A wind option was not a technology that provided as much opportunity for customers as a solar resource. So it was not the primary focus of the investigation in this case.
Was it considered at all?
I can't speak for the other parties, but the structure of the rate, I think, was part of the equation when I reviewed it. And I see the option one tariff rate being very beneficial for maximizing the potential economics for behind the meter solar generation. So that's how I view this rate.
Well, some of the answers I seem to recall yesterday were that, that there wasn't a party that was pressing that issue. That, coming from the rate case, there was the agreement that the solar option would be considered, and that none of the parties to the case were really focusing on a wind interest. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yes. Because the economics to a customer considering a renewable resource is leaning more towards solar resources and not wind resources.
And I was asking Mr. Pollock yesterday, I guess I had a thought that Occidental and FEA and LES, that the primary concern, at least in the first part of the litigated case, that the main focus was on making sure that things were cost-based, but also making sure that there weren't subsidies to other large customers. Was I correct?
Yes, and that would continue to be a major objective of all the, certainly my testimony, and as I understand it, all the other parties in the settlement.
And it's interesting because what he answered yesterday is real similar to some of the things that you said here this morning, that it's not only that now, but that there are companies that may have policies toward certain environmental goals, or just the potential economic benefits and compliance regarding carbon is also of interest to large generation customers like your clients, correct?
That is correct, yes.
I appreciated your explanations on pages 5 and 6 for the services and the way that the services operate. I wanted to ask you about a topic that seems to get a lot of play, and that's the 10% charge and it being a ceiling and not a floor. And initially, were you in agreement with the 10% charge?
As a maximum, yes.
And did you review Mr. Berger's testimony in this case?
I did.
And did you see that in his testimony, he said that, that costs actually could be more, where some parties argued that it could be less, that he said actually it could be more.
As a hypothetical, he did state that it could be more, yes.
And so what made you, Mr. Gorman, more comfortable with this second time looking at these issues, such that you were willing to agree to the 10%?
Well, it depends on the technology used behind the meter. If it is a thermal resource that burns natural gas, then those resources typically have very high reliability. A forced outage rate for a gas turbine might be 4 to 5%. The utility is going to have backup service, then it may need 4 to 5% of capacity resources to provide backup service to a thermal resource. If hydrogen can be produced in adequate quantities that allows that gas turbine to operate on hydrogen, then it could be operated as a non-carbon emitting resource and still have a high reliability. That assessment could be made after there's some operating history of the behind the meter resources. But the amount of capacity the utility would need in that instance would likely not be more than the effective forced outage rate of that resource, because it is a highly reliable resource and there's a high probability that it can take part of the customer's load off peak by operating behind the meter generation. There's also other factors that can distinguish the amount of capacity the utility would need to incur to provide backup service for a customer with behind the meter thermal resources. And that can include an assessment of the difference between the non-coincident demand of the customers and the coincident demand, which may further reduce the amount of capacity the utility needs to provide backup service to a customer with a highly reliable thermal behind the meter resource. So those are examples of certain instances where the utility's cost of providing backup service to a thermal resource might be far less than 10% of its demand charge.
Judge,
Mr. Lee,
and nobody could hear me. The last thing I heard was provide backup service to a customer with a highly reliable thermal behind the meter resource.
Mr. Gorman, was that your complete answer?
Let me restate that real quickly just to make sure. A highly reliable behind the meter thermal resource may have a forced outage rate of 4 to 5%, which would indicate that the utility would need no more than a 4 to 5% capacity resources to provide backup service to that customer with a highly reliable behind the meter resource. And that would be the case because there's a high likelihood or high probability that the behind the meter thermal resource would be operating during a period of system peak, which would reduce the customer's demand during system peak and lower the company's net peak demand on the system.
Excuse me, Mr. Gorman, are you saying 4 to 5% or 45%?
4 to 5%.
Thank you.
Mr. Gorman, of the two options, do you think that it's more probable that if SPS is going to get any behind the meter generation of this size for large customers, that it is going to come from option one?
I know there's a lot of interest in looking at the economics of option one for solar behind the meter generation, just given the geologic or geographic location of SPS's service territory. But there was real interest in backup service for thermal resource as well. So that I think customers would not be interested in working with the company to design a standby rate if there wasn't serious consideration on those customers of looking at the economics of behind the meter generation.
Do you know what it would cost to put in a 2 megawatt solar?
I don't have those numbers with me. No, I don't.
Do you know if it would be, do you know what it would cost to put in a 2 megawatt dispatchable generation?
I have not looked at that specifically either. A lot of it would depend on how it was fueled and what the source of fuel would be. You know, a gas turbine, for example, can be $1,000 per kW to install, maybe a little more. But the source of fuel to operate that gas turbine might be a larger investment than the actual gas turbine itself.
Would you agree? Hold on. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee, can you hear me? I've got.
Okay.
Are you there? Okay, there you are, Mr. Lee. We lost you.
Yes, ma'am. Would you like me to read back what I last heard?
Sure.
Mr. Gorman, of the two options, do you think that it's more probable that if SPS is going to get any behind the meter generation of this size for large customers, it is going to come from?
Mr. Gorman, can you give me your answer again?
Yes, I think there is serious consideration for many large customers of looking at behind the meter generation investments. A first step of producing those economic analyses is the existence of a standby rate to make it economically viable for behind the meter generation. With all the parties interested in negotiating the standby service rate, I think is clear indication that some of those economic studies are in process or being given serious consideration by many customers on the system.
And Mr. Gorman, would you agree? And I believe it was a witness yesterday that I heard that one of the other considerations might be for a client such as the type, a large customer client, such as the type that you and Mr. Pollack represent, whether or not you could utilize your own fuel might also be a consideration?
Could potentially be a consideration, yes.
I guess not knowing the you know, the amounts off the top of my head of customer usage and also how much it would cost to put in self-generation of either type. I'm just wondering, like you say, and the fact that SPS doesn't have any large customers that have behind the meter, whether or not this is actually something that we're going to see in the near future or long term. Any thoughts on that, Mr. Gorman?
I think it all, my assessment suggests that it all depends on the economics of behind the meter generation. You know, if there are true benefits of installing behind the meter generation to modify customer demands on
Excuse me, Mr. Gorman, if you would start again, please.
Okay. But my assessment is that it depends on the economics of the behind the meter generating resources. To the extent the standby tariff option enhances the true economics of those investments, and industrial customers will be more likely to move sooner rather than later for those types of investments. But the investments could also be driven by corporate policy and zero carbon reduction efforts which may be given as much or even more priority than the economics of the behind-the-meter generation. Neither instance, however, a well-structured standby tariff rate for both solar and thermal resources is very important to ensure that the customers are able to initiate those corporate objectives without harming other SPS customers and ensuring that SPS can recover its cost of providing backup service.
All right, sir. My last question, I'm asking the, the witnesses, if participated in the first part of this, you know, because I keep hearing about, you know, the substantial amount of party effort that's been expended toward the negotiation process and the, and coming up with this stipulation.
Your Honor,
Did,
sorry to cut in. It appears Mr. Lee is not in the meeting.
that's the first time that's happened.
There he is.
Mr. Lee?
Judge, I have no idea what's happening. I'm not getting any messages. The last thing I got was, I guess, not knowing the, you know, amounts off the top of my head of customer usage and also how much it would cost to put in self-generation of either type. I'm just wondering, like I say, and the fact that SPS doesn't have any large customers that have behind the meter, whether or not this is actually something that we're going to see in the near future or long term. Any thoughts on that, Mr. Gorman?
Briefly, Mr. Gorman, I believe your answer was having this tariff, this type of tariff in effect.
Yes, having this tariff will support the corporate policies that are considering making behind-the-meter investments. Those can include maximizing the economic justification of those investments, or alternatively, making investments to achieve corporate environmental carbon reduction initiatives or other environmental objectives.
And my last question, sir, is it looks like a substantial effort has been made in the past month or 6 weeks to arrive in the stipulation. Can you give me your opinion as to why such efforts weren't put into place originally to create this tariff?
I can't state why we didn't have the cooperative effort that we did after the commission directed the parties to work and meet the stipulated terms from the last case, but more recently, all parties have worked diligently and cooperatively to negotiate a standby tariff rate. I think we have embraced a tariff rate that largely followed the New Mexico Large Customer Group Witness original design of a solar option rate, but modified to where the company and other parties are comfortable with it, and will encourage customers to make all investments necessary to modify demands to reduce their power cost and to minimize SPS's cost of providing service.
Thank you. I think the other parties were attributing it to the recommended decision.
I think I was too, and it's just not as explicitly as that. That clearly created an incentive for all parties to work together, and I believe all parties did work together after that recommended decision.
Well, I thank you, sir. That's the questions that I had for you. Hearing examiner, Anaya Allen, do you have questions for Mr. Gorman?
Yes, I do have a few questions. Thank you very much, Examiner Hurst. Mr. Gorman, I had a question about the maintenance energy charge and the scheduling of maintenance and how you see that being a positive aspect of creating a standby rate.
Hold on, hold up. why don't we take a 10-minute recess at this point, and I'll see if Mr. Lee can't reboot. And we'll come back at 10:15. Remember, we're still live on YouTube. Okay, just for. Okay, just for people waiting, I've been informed that potentially this is citywide. And this internet issue, and we still do not have our court reporter back yet. We were on the telephone with him, and so I apologize. We have to have the court reporter, so. Um, I guess let's try for let's try for 15 minutes. Let's come back at 10:30. And hopefully that's going to give him enough time to reboot and come back, because he's not here. That'll give people time to get a water and a coffee, and so we're going to stay recessed until 10:30.
Hey, Drew, golly.
Your video's still on.
Oh,
Yeah, Joan, you're
you.
not muted.
Hey, Mr. Lee.
Hello, Judge. I apologize.
Can you
Hey,
hear?
Mr. Lee.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I hear there's an Xfinity. An Xfinity outage in the city of Santa Fe.
That's what I understand, Judge.
Okay, I was gonna offer, I just talked to IT and they said they could set you up here.
If it's necessary, I've got a hotspot here as well, that if it goes out again, we can switch to the hotspot.
Okay, great. Well,
The last thing I got was, you asked the question about why they hadn't reached a stipulation, and the last thing Mr. Gorman said was, but modified to where the company and other parties are comfortable with it and will encourage customers to make all investments necessary to modify demands to.
okay, we're back on the record. Mr. Gorman, that seemed to be the substance of your answer.
Believe it was a modified demand to make the system more efficient and to encourage customers to make economic and consumption decisions.
Very well. And I had finished with my questions. Thank you, Mr. Gorman. And hearing examiner Allen, you had some questions for Mr. Gorman.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, back to where we were about to start, Mr. Gorman. I had a question for you about the maintenance demand charge, and how valuable it is to the utility to be able to schedule maintenance, and how that ties into their ability to reduce the amount of power that they might be required to have available, for example, through the Southwest Power Pool requirements.
It's a very important consideration in assessing what the utility's cost of providing standby services. Under maintenance power, utility can refuse to accept a maintenance schedule from the customer with behind the meter generation if they don't have available generating capacity to provide that maintenance backup service. So the utility doesn't need to go out and buy additional capacity to provide maintenance service. Rather, it provides maintenance service from existing capacity that isn't currently needed to provide service to customers. So in effect, the utility really doesn't have an incremental cost of capacity to provide maintenance service.
Because maintenance service would, of course, be scheduled during low peak or lower usage periods,
Right.
off peak, and so on.
Correct. And it would be served from capacity that otherwise would not be used to provide service.
Okay, thank you. Now, my understanding is LES and FEA don't currently, or perhaps have plans to utilize the standby rate through development of any behind the meter generation facilities of their own.
I'm not aware of any firm commitments to move forward with behind the meter generation, but I know both parties are motivated to minimize their cost of power and make their load on the system as efficient as possible. And they are evaluating those options to make their operations as efficient as possible. So those are types of studies and considerations that both LES and FEA do on a regular basis.
And so both option 1 and option 2 would be beneficial to LES and FEA if they're approved by the commission in their long-term plans or their development of behind the meter generation.
I can't speak to the economics because I haven't seen them, but yes, they would provide two different options to improve the load characteristics and demands they place on the system.
And would you agree to a certain extent at this point that the implementation of this, if this rate is somewhat theoretical? Is there, I believe we heard testimony that there are no existing customers that would be appropriate for this right, for use of this rate?
It is theoretical in a sense that it's kind of a first step for a lot of customers to consider, take seriously an investment in behind the meter generation. You need a standby rate. So it's the first step in moving towards encouraging customers to go forward with economic investment opportunities.
Okay. And about how long, what would you see as a time frame where we might start seeing customers signing up for the standby service rate?
I think that would depend on either the economics of the behind the meter investment or the corporate policy goals, which would trigger the timing of those types of investments.
Okay. And there was a number of questions that Commissioner Hurst asked about wind, which might be something that if it became more available for behind the meter generation, then its potential in the future would be perhaps revisions of the rate to accommodate wind if it became more feasible in the future.
I see that as an easy modification or expansion of the standby rate to accommodate different technology with different types of operating characteristics.
Thank you. And I guess somewhat
How
related.
so? Excuse me.
Oh, go ahead.
Mr. Gorman, how easy would the modification be? And
Well, the option one was designed with the expectation that the solar unit would be providing power when the sun is shining during peak periods. SPS's demands are during summer peak periods. So the rate is designed to recognize that solar facility will operate during high peak hours, including the coincident peak hour. So this rate is designed to recognize that customers with behind the meter generation will have a probability that their contributions to the system coincident peak demand will be lower with behind the meter generation, and that will lower the system cost and encourage customers to go forward with economic behind the meter investments.
right, but you specifically said that modifying that tariff to accommodate wind would be easy.
Wind generation would have a different type of impact on the customer's load characteristics, which could be estimated in measuring what an appropriate standby rate would be for wind generators, which could also consider the impact it would have on SPS's coincident demands, reduction in energy generation, and design a rate that encourages economic investments in behind the meter wind resources that would fully be reflected in standby rate design that allows SPS to recover its cost of that backup service.
Thank you.
So there was some discussion about wind and other potential types of behind the meter generation sources. And I guess I was wondering if there were, for example, and I believe there would be in SPS's territory, wind farms. Do those wind farms, would they utilize as opposed to like, other customers that aren't energy generators per se?
Yeah.
I mean, would wind farms make use of that type of standby rate if one were to be developed in the future? If there were, customers who started demonstrating an interest or need for that type of rate, would a wind farm be someone who would do that?
It would, but a wind farm would not be behind the meter. It would probably be at some remote location, which would still require delivery service from the company. So the cost structure would be different than a behind the meter type generating resource investments. And the utilities cost of providing service under a remote wind farm resource option would include both standby production and need for delivery of that wind resource to the actual customer meter.
But a wind farm, as an example, might not fall within the LTS customer category.
Well, it wouldn't be behind the meter generation, so it would be a viable resource, but the structure and cost of delivering that wind resource to the customer and providing standby service would be different than what we have included in option 1 and option 2.
All right. Well, it just gives us something more to work on in the future then, I guess. And those are my questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Gorman, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, hearing examiner Allen. Mr. Jernigan, any redirect for your witness?
Yes, ma'am. Just a couple of questions.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Gorman, do you recall you had a conversation regarding the 10% ceiling and how you're now more comfortable, or how you're comfortable with that and the current?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Lee is in the waiting room, so I didn't notice when he left the meeting. I've just readmitted him. Hi, Mr. Lee.
Hello, I've changed to a different internet. Hopefully that'll work. The last thing you asked the question about whether a wind farm would be someone who would use that. And the answer was they would, but a wind farm would not be behind the meter. It would probably be at some remote location where.
Okay.
Where the SPS would be required to provide delivery service to the customer's meter of that wind resource.
And I think then my final question on that was whether then that would be something that would need to be addressed in, a future modification or amendment to this rider.
It would, yes, it would be a different type of rate structure than what is anticipated with behind the meter generation. But it may be something that is beneficial to the system and to all customers to consider at some point in the future.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Gorman. Those are my questions for you today. And then Mr. Jernigan.
Mr. Jernigan, you have redirect, sir.
Yes, ma'am. Just a few questions. Mr. Gorman, do you recall a conversation you were having with regards to the 10% ceiling?
I do, yes.
And I believe you discussed how you were comfortable with it with various types of, sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. You had a couple conversations or discussions about how you're comfortable with it with various technology and generation sources. I didn't quite hear if solar was one of those. Are you comfortable with the 10% ceiling with regards to solar as well?
Yeah, the 10% ceiling applies to the backup generation charge in option 1 in the proposed settlement standby rate. In that rate, as we discussed before, in the event the solar facility doesn't operate as expected, then the combination of standby capacity charges and the payment of backup energy charges will require that customer to pay the same demand charges that they would have under rate 34. So the 10% production demand charge is fully reflected in the proposed option 1 standby service rate.
Thank you. I also think I heard this a couple of times, but I was hoping you might be able to expand on it a little bit. I believe at various points in your testimony that you mentioned that this tariff would be beneficial to all customers, not just those who are taking under the standby tariff, but all classes as well. Is that correct?
It is correct. Yeah, essentially this rate is a movement towards encouraging customers to make efficient consumption electric power decisions to minimize their cost of service, the annual payment for electric delivery costs from SPS. That in turn will change SPS's load patterns and load characteristics, which would be considered in their resource planning purposes and allow them to make their purchase and investments in production and transmission capacity more efficient, which will benefit all customers on the system by improving the efficiency and economics of SPS's cost of providing electric service.
Thank you, sir. That's all the questions I have, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Jernigan. Does anybody have any questions based on the commissioner's questions, hearing examiner Allen's questions, or my questions?
Hearing examiner Hurst, I have just a couple, if that's okay.
There you are, Mr. Rushoff. Go
Hi
ahead,
there.
sir.
Good morning, Mr. Gorman.
Good morning.
I had just a couple of questions because there's been a lot of discussion about wind generation. So I just wanted to clarify a little bit of your testimony. So I think you said for behind the meter purposes, the economics of solar outweighs wind. Was that your testimony?
So the structure of option one would probably improve the economics of a solar renewable investment more so than a wind renewable investment.
Right. And are you aware of any large customers who might be considering behind the meter wind generation?
I am not, no.
In your experience, wind generation has a less consistent generation pattern than solar. Is that correct?
During on-peak periods, that's true, yes.
Right. And that was actually going to be my next question. So solar generally produces more consistently during peak periods. In your experience, all things being equal, let's say a 20 megawatt solar facility versus a 20 megawatt wind facility, the footprint of a wind facility would be much larger than a solar facility. Is that correct?
The footprint would be larger and the volume of impact on the footprint would be much greater for a wind facility, given the size of the wind turbine blades and potential other facilities that may be necessary to operate the industrial facility. It'd be more complicated to install a behind the meter wind facility compared to a solar facility.
So a large customer considering a behind the meter wind facility might have greater siting challenges than if a solar facility. Is that correct?
I would expect so, yes.
And do those factors, the siting and kind of footprint, kind of go into your thought that a solar is more economic than wind for behind the meter generation?
No, that's based on the structure of option one, which provides greater economic benefits to eliminate on-peak or to produce more energy during the on-peak compared to the off-peak. And a solar facility produces more energy during the on-peak period.
Okay, thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rushoff. Any further questions for Mr. Gorman? No. Hearing none. Mr. Gorman, thank you again, sir. You are excused.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for accommodating my schedule. It's very much appreciated.
Yes, sir. Anything further from FEA LES?
No, Your Honor.
Well, I believe that then concludes the, who witness presentation in this case. I do have one more bench request for SPS for Mr. Berger. And this relates to a question that Commissioner Ellison asked yesterday. And in the draft transcript, I just cut from around page 693, and it is a wind question. And the question says, let's start it from 692. About the wind example that hearing examiner Hurst was asking you about, if you look at the other generator option, it seems to me that it would be a bad fit. It wouldn't always hit with these backup demand charges because you've got a non-dispatchable generator. Question. Answer. Well, it depends. This is Mr. Berger. It depends on how you size the amount of the behind the meter generation relative to your load. When net capacity factors as generators have improved dramatically in the last decade. SPS, for instance, are running at approximately 49–50% capacity factors for a year. That's daylight and nighttime, right? Those are pretty high. If you build enough of them relative to your load size, you would end up having excess energy at times, but you wouldn't automatically have to pay backup charges. I don't agree that that would be the result. Question from Commissioner Ellison. Well, I mean, wouldn't you need to set, some level of demand such that you could determine when the grid and how much the grid is stepping into supply? Wind has great onto page 694. Great capacity factor if you've got, these big turbines, but sometimes it's operating at 100% and sometimes it's 0. That's just the way it works. If you've, nominated a certain amount, say 50% of your load, what you've declared that you need standby service for, the demand charges invariably begin when your wind generator hits 0. Isn't that correct? Mr. Berger answered, if it hits 0, yes. Commissioner Ellison said, they do, these big wind farms do. Mr. Berger testified, sure, I just don't agree with the characterization that it happens every day or even every month. It hits 0. Even if it hits 0 every month, we have daily prorated thing. So if there's a few days when the wind doesn't blow, you're still paying the same amount as you would under just paying this monthly standard reservation charge. It can work. You have to really study it and size it appropriately, and maybe we'll decide in the future, this is on to 695, it doesn't work, and we'll come up with a third option. But like I was saying earlier, that's a possibility. This is probably other technologies that we could add to this list. So based on that exchange between the commissioner's questions and Mr. Berger's answers, bench request is this. Mr. Berger asserted wind could work. The bench request is to provide some either scenario similar to what was offered in his testimony or other evidence. Doesn't have to be a time-consuming calculation, a demonstration supporting his assertion that wind would work under option 2. Mr. Stewart, Ms. Hardy, is that clear? What the bench request is?
Yes, I understand what the request is.
Okay. Very well. Anyone have anything else procedural that we need to deal with? I just want to, I don't hear anybody, don't see anyone waving. Just want to remind parties pursuant to the order on procedural schedule for the stipulation, item 5 on page 2, item F. I don't have any legal briefing that I know of. Hearing examiner Allen, do you have any point that you think needs briefed?
I think perhaps what the legal necessity is for having a standby rate for solar. If there is a statutory or regulatory basis for that as a requirement.
Okay. Therefore, parties should address that, and in any proposed certification are due by May 1st, this year, 2023. Also, due to the expedited nature of this case, I would remind parties that in item G, exceptions to the certification and stipulation are limited to 5 days, so that the commission will be able to consider this and get an appropriate order out before the time deadline in this case. And if there's no any further questions, thank you all for your participation. I apologize for any technical difficulties that we encountered. And
Ma'am?
I thank you, Ms. Drake.
Yeah, sorry. I did have a question, and it's regarding the briefing issue. On the legal necessity for having a standby rate for solar, do you, just to clarify what you want there, are you looking for something in addition to the commitment from the stipulation in the prior rate case that was approved by the commission, that provided that we would actually propose a standby rate for solar?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
Ms. Drake, thank you. Thank you for that clarification, because, right, I mean, that is a legal basis as well, right? Because it was in a prior decision approved by the commission, but.
Yeah, so I if you want briefing from us, I just wanted to clarify if you wanted us to go beyond that or what? Because we could all answer that in one line and make it easy, or do you want us to go beyond that?
I think it could be helpful. I don't want a huge, a page or so, maybe, if even that, just if there is
Okay.
something specific, then, I think
Okay,
providing that information would be helpful. Thank you.
great. Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Very well. Okay. If there's nothing further, again, apologize for any technical difficulties. Thank you all for your participation, and we are adjourned.